It's airborne.
Fresh, brand new virus. We don't have a blood test. We don't know how it's transmitted. We don't know diddly squat. You know it's the biggest thing we've ever seen. If you leave us alone, we'll map this guy down to its last gene. Make you famous.
Okay, people, welcome back to the channel. This video is going to be starting a new series while still staying in the same vicinity of the previous videos, such as the 9/11 series, the Ed Snowden series, Deep State, Black Project series, DARPA, the last one I put out. Staying in the vicinity of that scheme, in this series I'm going to cover, hang on, let me reword that. In this series, I'm going to attempt to cover the COVID outbreak and the vaccinations that go along with the COVID outbreak. Now, when I say I'm going to attempt to cover that, obviously, if you're watching this video now, it posted. Let me just speak really quick to the people who don't create content and post videos. I've only had one strike on my channel since I've started this. And it was actually on my other channel, the very first channel I started when I was doing music reactions. When I decided not to do music reactions, start covering politics and current events, then I had posted one 2-minute clip of Candace Owens speaking about her friends and the people that she was close with having pregnancy side effects of the vaccinations, right? It was about a 2.5 minute segment. And as soon as I posted that video, it took me back then it took me 3 days to make a video, still does, but as soon as I posted the video, it was taken down and deleted completely. Like, I had no files of it whatsoever. And YouTube claimed that I was spreading misinformation with that segment of a 2-minute clip. I hope this does post. I hope you get to see it. We're going to tackle the inception of the COVID virus. All things go well, we'll end with the vaccinations for the COVID virus. Now, a lot of you may have heard of the COVID virus for the very first time in a news clip, something like this.
And rare pneumonia-like virus that has caused at least 2 deaths and has spread from China to other countries in Asia. And federal health officials don't want it to spread here, so they are screening passengers arriving from central China at 3 major airports. That type of screening hasn't happened since the Ebola outbreak.
However, at that stage in my life, I was not keeping up with current events, so technically, I remember sitting on the couch waiting for the game to start. And this happened. This is how I learned about it.
As soon as we get any kind of information, we will certainly pass it along.
The game tonight has been postponed. You are all safe. And take your time in leaving the arena tonight and do so in an orderly fashion. Thank you for coming out tonight.
COVID. And I remember standing up in my living room. My daughter was in a chair in the living room and my wife was sitting on the other end of the couch. I remember me telling both of them, this is about to get bad and we need to go to the store tomorrow. And of course my wife laughed me out of the living room. I ended up going to the store the next day and getting toilet paper and milk and water because the NBA doesn't cancel venues. And if I have not shown you in my previous videos or the extent that parts of this government will go to, and you hadn't got the hint, you might want to check out the past videos to get the hint before we jump into this. Without any more delay.
7 million dead, countless lives ruined, but 5 years later, the world is still asking, how did this happen and who is responsible? As a foreign news reporter for The Sun, I've watched as claims about COVID's origins, once widely dismissed as conspiracy theories and pseudoscience, have gone mainstream.
CDC also has an office in Beijing, and my team there told me about 27 new cases of a new respiratory illness that was undefined, that wasn't flu, and it wasn't SARS.
David Asher has spent decades rubbing shoulders with the most powerful people on Capitol Hill. As an investigator, he's worked on some of the US government's most classified intelligence operations.
Biotech, which is an area that gave me some interest in COVID-19 as it emerged. I'm not a whistleblower. I can only talk about what I saw as an investigator. And what I saw was just patently outrageous. Understand, the Department of State has thousands of sources in China. These are not spies. These are Chinese officials. These are Chinese citizens. They're good people. What we're hearing consistently, that there's something really odd about this emerging pandemic. We didn't have a classified capability in Wuhan, but we had plenty of cables, and I don't know why those cables haven't seen the light of day. But the cables indicated there was this huge influenza surge. This ILI, influenza-like illness, started spreading quite rapidly. which was a clear indication, whether you are a spook or not, something was wrong with this influenza-like illness that was not influenza.
I talked to my counterpart, George Gao, in China, who ran the Chinese CDC. George told me pretty quickly that he didn't feel there was any evidence of human-to-human transmission, and they didn't think that there was asymptomatic illness. I said, George, what's your case definition? And he said, Bob, it's someone with an unspecified pneumonia that's not flu or not SARS that came from the wet market. And I said, well, George, then by definition, everybody came from the wet market because you're only looking at people from the wet market. So I said, you have to go outside the wet market. 2 or 3 days later, he called me back and he said, Bob, we have hundreds of cases and it has nothing to do with the wet market. I've offered to put a team in from CDC. I had over 20 people lined up to go. My counterpart, George, he said he couldn't give me approval. And then I went to ask President Trump if he would call the president of China, which he did. I was there in the Oval Office, but we never got an answer on any of our requests.
We had conclusively seen evidence that as early as mid-November 2019, the Chinese Communist Party was engaged in a frenzied cover-up of something going on in Wuhan, China. And the information all was consistent with a huge surge of activity involving some national security incident. Something was going on in the imperial city that was keeping Xi Jinping up late at night that we didn't know about.
I could tell George's personality changed in his interactions with me. I do think after the second week of January ongoing, I don't think we had a private conversation. I think he felt limited in what he could say to me.
About the origins
Not
of
everything.
this virus?
I would say the conversation we had by the second week of January was very different than any conversation I'd ever had with him over the years. If we'd gotten in, I would have learned probably within a week that this virus was very human-to-human transmissible.
It's likely they didn't let you go because you would have realized that quite quickly.
I think they already knew that, right? And they knew that. They're scientists and they're doctors.
They knew it was ready-made for humans.
No, they knew, well, some people probably knew that, in my view. They knew it was highly infectious for humans. You know, you go back and look at remember the pictures of them building the 25,000 person hospitals. They quarantined 11 million people in the city. They did that because they understood this was a big problem.
One of my friends who is one of the most famous biologists in U.S. national security, whose name I won't quote, I asked him, I said, what's your read on what's going on in China? And he says, it's a meltdown. It's like Chernobyl, except it's biology. It didn't take a rocket scientist to see that this thing looks supernatural. The only question is, how did it get into nature? And that's where my investigation focused.
The thing that made me angriest was the fact that there are individuals responsible for this.
Now, I want to discover why it's taken so long for the lab leak theory and those who sounded the alarm from the start to be taken seriously. So, I went to find them. US officials who were in the White House as COVID took hold.
This is not natural. This was orchestrated.
Investigators with access to classified information.
This is the biggest intelligence failure in the history of the world. I mean, Watergate was nothing.
And the ordinary citizens who stepped up to uncover the truth.
This is the worst example of biomedical malpractice in the history of human existence.
To ask why the highest levels of the US government may want the true origins of COVID to remain a secret.
One person's conspiracy is another person's strategy.
I'm an investigative reporter. We use Freedom of Information Act requests to obtain documents about the origins of COVID.
Sifting through mountains of documents, they uncovered some curious facts about what had been happening in Wuhan. Before the pandemic, there were a very limited number of laboratories in the world working on coronaviruses. One of the largest was the Wuhan Institute of Virology, a sprawling complex located just 40 minutes from the city's now infamous wet market.
The CCP had big ambitions in biotech, and those ambitions were concentrated in the city of Wuhan. The lab had sort of become internationally famous for discovering the key components that made up the original SARS virus, and they were looking towards the future.
Led by a Chinese scientist named Dr. Shi Zhengli, the Wuhan team scoured China's provinces hunting for SARS-like viruses in the wild, which could pose a risk to humanity in the future.
They were interested in something like SARS 2.0. So they were doing a lot of prospecting for these novel SARS-like coronaviruses in caves in southern China, in remote areas, and bringing it back to the city of Wuhan.
In the Wuhan lab, Dr. Shi and her team experimented on some of their newly discovered viruses, souping them up to make them more virulent or deadly using methods known as gain-of-function virology.
Gain of function refers to when you take a virus and you give it a new trait, a new feature that enables it to be more infectious or more dangerous. That's basically all we mean by gain of function.
The premise is that if you do this, that you can more effectively develop therapeutics and vaccines.
In the US in 2014, a federal pause on funding for certain types of gain-of-function research was introduced, meaning no US government money could be used to fund research like what was being undertaken in Wuhan. In 2017, the pause was lifted. Every year, billions of dollars of US government money is dished out to various virus projects around the world. All of this money leaves a paper trail.
We follow the money wherever it leads. So we were reviewing this list of over 300 foreign laboratories that are eligible or actively receiving funding from the National Institutes of Health, and saw on this list the Wuhan Institute of Virology and started to connect the dots. Here we have this respiratory virus breaking out in the city of Wuhan. Here's the Wuhan Institute of Virology on this list of labs getting NIH money, and here are these papers they've been publishing about their collaborations with EcoHealth Alliance, where they were going into bat caves, collecting these novel coronaviruses, and then manipulating the laboratory to make them more dangerous to human beings. Just since the pandemic began, they've received over $56 million in new taxpayer funding. Half of that has come from the Department of Defense, from accounts that are funding weapons of mass destruction related programs.
We also know from public records that they struggled with biosafety standards.
People working in the Wuhan lab were not wearing proper personal protective equipment, without proper protection, going into caves, capturing bats, bringing some of the bats back to the Wuhan lab, bringing samples back to the Wuhan lab.
There's been an article from 2015, a published article from Dr. Ralph Barrick in North Carolina and Dr. Zhengli Shi in Wuhan, China, where they created a super virus. They took parts of other viruses and made a virus.
One of the gain-of-function experiments that they did at the Wuhan Institute of Virology resulted in the creation of a virus which was 10,000 times more infectious.
The first intelligence the U.S. government had that's credible about the origins of COVID-19 was the highly sensitive, highly specific intelligence related to workers falling sick in the lab that Dr. Shi ran.
In the middle of September, 3 things happened in that laboratory. For some reason, they changed the command structure from the civilian command structure to a military command structure. The second thing they did was they deleted the database of the sequences that they had, which is highly irregular for scientists to delete years worth of work. And the third thing they did, and I think the most telling, is they put out a contract for a new ventilation system for that laboratory. And that's exactly when we started to see evidence now, also declassified, of new infections in the area of a respiratory tract-like illness that looked like flu but wasn't flu. I think that's when the pandemic started. There was a paper published in March 2020 called The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2, which argued that it could not have possibly come out of a laboratory. It was very influential.
Within weeks, it had been read 3 million times, downloaded more than 5.7 million times, and cited in nearly 3,000 scientific papers.
He's asking me to explain what a furin cleavage site is. You know, I told him then, I said, I think this is the evidence that this was created in the laboratory. The SARS-CoV-2 virus that caused this pandemic was ready to infect people from the start. It was extremely infectious from the start. That's very unusual in a novel virus. Normally it has to evolve to be good at infecting people. One of the reasons for that is that it had in it a thing called a furin cleavage site in the middle of its spike gene, which made it much more infectious and much more capable of spreading in the lungs of people in particular. Now, that's unique. That's not been seen in any other SARS-like virus before. We've looked at over 800 SARS-like viruses now, and we've never seen a furin cleavage site. What the furin cleavage site did was change the orientation of the COVID binding site for the H2 receptor, which is the human receptor, right? So normally it would go like this. Nothing would bind. It would bounce off. But the furin cleavage site would then change the orientation. So now the binding site went like this. And all of a sudden, in the presence of furin cleavage site, the binding domain of the COVID virus fits perfectly into the binding domain of the receptor in the human cell, the H2 receptor. Right? Very purposeful. Now you ask the question, why does the COVID that came from bats no longer efficiently affect bats? Well, the reason is because they rechanged the orientation of the binding site so it infects humans. They proposed to change this virus so that it would bind to the H2 receptor, put in a furin cleavage site and do all this, and lo and behold, that's the virus that comes out. And that's a grant proposal that they put in a year before the COVID outbreak even happened.
In 2005, our State Department said China's working on bioweapons, coronavirus bioweapons.
In 2011, at the Biological Weapons Convention, the Chinese actually made a declaration that they were basically pursuing a synthetic biological pathway for potential weapons development. And at the time, when I talked to people and who were there, they were like, yeah, it was shocking. It was almost like they were dropping a death card, you know, like in Apocalypse Now, you know, you mess with us, this is going to be happening to you.
Remember when we were all told that the coronavirus originated in a Chinese wet market? Republican Senator Tom Cotton was lambasted by the media for suggesting the coronavirus actually originated in an infectious disease lab rather than an animal market, as the Chinese government claimed. Snopes called Cotton's claims speculative, the BBC called them unfounded, and the Washington Post went so far as to say that the lab leak theory was debunked. After New York Magazine published an expose highlighting the legitimacy of the theory, many of those media outlets published stories confirming that yes, the coronavirus may have originated in a Wuhan lab. And now, we know that scientists consulting with the US government early in the pandemic believed that the coronavirus had originated in the lab. But Dr. Anthony Fauci worked to shut that hypothesis down.
The people who weaponize lies are killing people.
For years now, we have listened to smear, ridicule and mock anyone who dared question the origins of COVID-19. You know, the virus that shut down our way of life and killed millions. They wouldn't entertain any other explanations. The truth is that the most logical explanation of the origin of COVID-19 was dismissed because it came from, yep, you guessed it, Donald Trump. President Trump was dismissed as a racist for even suggesting that COVID-19 came from China.
In this country, your own aide, Secretary Azar, says he does not use this term. He says ethnicity does not cause the virus. Why do you keep using this? A lot of people say it's racist.
It's not racist at all, no, not at all. It comes from China. That's why. It comes from China. I want to be accurate.
And now, over 3 years since the pandemic began, the US Energy Department and FBI has finally conceded that COVID-19 most likely leaked from a Wuhan lab. Vindication for all those who had their eyes open the whole way through.
That's going to do it for the video today, guys. And as always, thank you for coming and hanging out. I know there's other places you can be watching other people do other things. I thank you for the time that you come here to watch my videos. I'll see you next time.
Why do we feel it's necessary to yak about bullshit in order to be comfortable? That's when you know you found somebody really special. And you can just shut the fuck up for a minute, comfortably share silence.
You stopped off for ice cream.
When the fuck did we get ice cream?